You're about to hear a message from the series Sent Ones by Phil Brainerd. The message today is From Peter the Unknown to Peter the Great. We hope you enjoy it. In 1994, moviegoers were treated to a very interesting film. The film was about a man named Forrest Gump. The film was based on a fictional novel by an author named Winston Groom. There was never any real person named Forrest Gump. However, there are still some interesting things that we can glean from the film. Forrest starts life with several deficits. He has an IQ of 70, which is considered intellectually challenged. His father is never around. Forrest has a physical handicap. He has to wear metal braces to help straighten out his legs. You would think that with all those deficits, Forrest would never be truly successful at anything. But as novels like this go, you would be wrong. Fortunately for Forrest, the braces worked. He eventually outgrew them and even became an incredible runner. He became such a good athlete, he received a sports scholarship to college and even became an All-American. What Forrest lacked in IQ, he made up for with heart and hard work. Even though his father was absent, his mother was caring and very faithful. She taught him about character and a positive attitude. She's the source of the famous quote, "Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get." To make a long story short, Forrest eventually became a fantastically successful person and even a celebrity. The moral of the story, according to the film, is that if you have heart, people who care about you, and some luck, you can go from nothing to great success and fame. Of course, that's just a story. Do things like that happen in real life? Well, I think the reason the film was so popular is that we'd all like to think that it does happen in real life. We're in our series, The King and I. Matthew tells us about the King of the universe. We're working our way systematically through Matthew's book about the life of Jesus. In our last session, we started a sub-series called Sent Ones. Jesus had a message, a vital message, the gospel. He wanted that message to go out into the whole world, and he needed some special people to make it happen. So he chose 12 men he called the apostles. That word apostle means sent ones. In our last session, we asked the question, what went into his selection? Today we're going to ask the question, who were these men? Let's read their names. They're found in Matthew 10 and starting in verse 2. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. There were 12 whom Jesus chose to be his sent ones. So how should we do this? Should we have 12 separate messages, one for each? Well, the problem with that approach is that for some of the men, we don't know a whole lot about them. Others we do. So here's what we're going to do. We'll have more than one message based on what we know for certain about these men. But not 12. We'll combine a few along the way. Today we're going to look at the first man on the list, the Apostle Peter, also known as Simon. Now with him, we know a lot, so we'll give him a whole message. Peter was a man who started out with a number of deficits. He was largely unknown when he met Jesus. Years later, he became the best known of all the apostles. His life and his role in the Christian faith inspired one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe, the Basilica of Peter in the Vatican. To this day, the name Peter is a popular name in Western culture. What changed this man from unknown to world-famous leader? Was it like Forrest Gump? Was it heart, hard work, and luck? Well, let's find out. Our message today has the title, Peter the Unknown to Peter the Great. So let's look at some things about Peter. The first thing we know is that he was relatively unknown and unimportant. And I say relatively, everybody's important to their family and friends and things like that, but on a world scale, certainly unknown and unimportant. If you've been along for our journey through the book of Matthew, you know that Peter started out as a fisherman. We read about that back in Matthew 4 and verse 18. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Fishing was a respectable calling in the days of Jesus, just like farming and carpentry and tent making and other professions that we read about in the Bible. It just wasn't the way to become famous. Later, after Jesus died, rose again, and went up into heaven, Peter wound up leading the 12 apostles. This made him very visible, and it got Peter into trouble. In the book of Acts, Peter and John were hauled before the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of ancient Israel. After listening to Peter and John, this is how the leaders reacted. We see it in Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. The top leaders of Israel all looked at each other and said, "Who are these men? They're unschooled. They're ordinary." Now, how might you become famous and influential in the days of Jesus? You could come from the right family, a family where you inherited wealth and power. That was the case with King Herod and other leaders. You could be a great military man. You could be a great athlete. The Greeks loved their athletes and gave them all kinds of recognition. You will recall the Olympic Games. They were invented way back in the time of Greece. Now, you could be a scholar. Many who spend time in church know the name Nicodemus. He was considered the teacher of Israel, and there were others like him. People with names like Akiva, Hillel, and Shammai. Most people don't know their names today, but they were famous in ancient Israel. Some of those names are known to the Jewish people to this day. Those are the ways you became famous and influential in the days of Jesus. And actually, those ways exist today. But fishermen? No, that's not how you became famous and influential. Apparently, when Peter and John were examined by the ruling elite of ancient Israel, only one thing stood out. They had been with Jesus. And that started years earlier. Right after we learned that Peter and his brother Andrew were fishermen, we learned that Jesus invited them to follow him. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. So Peter was one of a group of men who spent time with Jesus. A lot of time. And notice something here. Jesus invited these men to follow him. What did he offer as a reward? What was the motivation that he gave to these men? Did he say, "Follow me, and I will make you famous"? Did he say, "Hey, Peter, follow me, and I will change you from Peter the unknown to Peter the Great"? No. He said, "Follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." That was enough. These men didn't leave their nets expecting a pathway to greatness. I'm not sure they even fully understood what Jesus was offering. They just knew that they were getting a personal invitation to spend time with Jesus. And that was enough. Friends, Jesus invites us all to spend time with him, to follow him. Today we spend time with him by coming to church and worshiping. We spend time with him when we listen to messages in church. We spend time with him when we listen to messages of our Christian leaders on the radio or TV. We spend time with him when we read his word, the Bible. We spend time with him when we pray. If you spend time with Jesus, you may be rewarded with something on this earth, like fame, or you may be rewarded with a deep knowledge of his great love for you. For many people, that's enough. Let's learn more about Peter's change from unknown to great. Here's another thing. As you read about Peter, you will find that he was a man who lacked courage. We read in Matthew 8 in verse 23, "Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him," that was Jesus. "Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. the disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." We went into this story in detail a while back. For now, let's just say that this story tells us that Peter was not a courageous person. He saw a storm blow up on the lake. Granted, it was a bad storm. However, it's clear that Peter, as well as the other disciples of Jesus, were scared to death. Compare that with your typical action movie hero. Somebody with a big military outfit with guns and big muscles. They would shake their fist at the clouds and fight to the last breath. Peter was not like that. He was not one of those. And it gets worse. Let's look at the night that Jesus was betrayed. A number of chapters later, back in Matthew 26, we read this starting in verse 31. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." So Peter was a brave guy, at least in his own estimation. Jesus said, "So, you think you're brave? Let me tell you something, Peter. We're about to go into a very scary situation. Before the night is over, you will deny that you ever knew me, and you'll do it 3 times. This is one of the most famous stories in the Bible, and perhaps one of the saddest. When the soldiers showed up to arrest Jesus, the apostles and disciples all fled, including Peter. He followed from a distance as Jesus was taken away and got as far as the courtyard of the high priest during the trial. There Peter was identified as one of the followers of Jesus. And sure enough, he denied Jesus. Not once, but 3 times. How did Peter react to his failure? We read in Matthew 26 and verse 75. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Peter realized he had failed, and failed miserably. He let down his best friend, and he let him down after following for years. Peter saw Jesus display incredible acts of supernatural power that the rest of us can only long to see. But he still failed. Peter was a coward. But later something happened. Recall when we read earlier about Peter and John being called before the Sanhedrin. Let's read that again, Acts 4 and verse 13. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. Imagine this. This is only a few months after the death of Jesus. Jesus had been taken before the Sanhedrin. There they ran a mock trial, found Jesus guilty, and sent him off to be crucified. The very same thing could happen again, only this time with Peter. Yet Peter spoke before this group boldly. He was so bold, he showed such courage, that onlookers were astonished. Something changed Peter from a cowardly man into a courageous man. What was it? To understand this, we have to ask a question. At what point did Jesus know that Peter would fail him? Jesus knew it at least as far back as when he made that prediction that Peter would deny him 3 times. But could it have been even earlier? In a recent series, we looked at something that King David wrote in the book of Psalms. It's found in Psalm 139 and verse 15. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. God is aware of our deepest, inmost beings. He is aware of everything about us, and he's aware long before we are born. And Jesus was God visiting the face of the earth. Jesus knew who Peter was before he even called him. That means he knew about any strengths Peter had. That means he knew about any weaknesses that Peter had. And that means Jesus knew before Peter was born that he would fail. So why did he call Peter? Why not pick someone with more courage? Because of a principle we learned in the last session. Jesus doesn't call people based on their earthly gifts and accomplishments. Jesus calls people based on what they can become if they will give themselves over to him. Listen to this. This is important. For Peter, the point wasn't that he went into the courtyard and failed. The point is that he went into the courtyard. There he learned something very important. He learned that he was a weak man. He learned something that the Apostle Paul wrote about at a later time. Paul had a problem that he called his thorn in the flesh. It was something painful that he couldn't beat. So he prayed that God would take it away. Here's how God answered the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Look at that. My power is made perfect in weakness. Before Peter could truly experience God's power, he had to understand that he himself was weak. Before he could be courageous, he had to realize that by himself he was a coward. Learning that required a painful experience. Once Peter understood this, he was on the way to becoming courageous. Let's stop for a moment. Have you ever had a time in your life where you tried something, but you failed? You see, as far as God goes, failure isn't such a big problem. He loves you. He knows you. If you have sinned, ask God to forgive you. He will gladly do it. If you failed because you didn't know something, ask God to teach you. He will gladly do it. If you failed because you were weak, that's when you realize that God can give you strength. Or how about this? Have you ever had a time in your life when you wanted to do something good, something important, something meaningful, but you didn't even try? You didn't even try because you thought you might fail. Well, sometimes we fail. With God, that's not a reason to give up before we even start. Now, we'll give the standard warning here. This doesn't mean that you should do something foolish or stupid, but if you've given it thought, and it's something you should try, maybe you should give it a try. Why? Because God's power is made perfect in weakness. Until we know we are weak, we can never truly see God's power. For Peter, there was a lot more weakness to go. For one thing, Peter was not a highly intelligent man. We saw that in our last session. Jesus spoke on a number of occasions in parables. One time, Peter didn't understand. We see that in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 15. Peter said, "Explain the parable to us." "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. Wow, that was cold. Are you still so dull? There's a well-known saying, wisdom is not always about knowing a lot. It's knowing what you don't know. Peter eventually became a great teacher, but before he could do that, he had to learn that there was a lot he didn't know. Next, we see that Peter was a prideful man. This is a big problem when you know how much God values humility. We learned about one demonstration of Peter's pride when he announced that he would never deny Jesus, and then only a few hours later he did it 3 times. Sometimes to learn humility, prideful people need to fall hard. There's one other time that shows the extent of Peter's pride and how much he needed to be warned. Jesus told his followers on one occasion that he would have to go to Jerusalem and there be crucified. Peter didn't like that idea, and he thought he would straighten out Jesus. Here is the famous reply of Jesus, found in Matthew 16 and verse 22. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Wow. Understand what's happening here. Here's Peter. He is the man who will one day lead the apostles in sending the message of Jesus out into the world. And Jesus has to warn him that it's possible for him to be influenced by, if not controlled by, Satan. There was no point in Jesus even pretending that he was talking to Peter. He's talking through Peter to the enemy. This is what happens when pride overwhelms a person. This is a warning for us all. If the Apostle Peter can find himself in a state where he's under the influence of Satan, how much more can any of us? Pride can be a terrible thing. But there's something that can cure a prideful heart. There's something that can make up for all kinds of deficits. And Peter needed to learn about it. Peter needed to learn to love. After Jesus died and rose from the dead, he had a few more words for Peter. We read about it in John 21 and verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." After all he had been through, Peter was now ready to learn one of his most important lessons. He needed to grow in love. One of the premier signs of loving Jesus is when you love his sheep. These are the people that Jesus died for. He certainly loves them. How much did Jesus love his sheep? He was willing to die for them. So he had some final words for Peter. Reading on in verse 18. "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." What did Jesus mean by that? In verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Jesus is telling Peter that it's love that carries you through all the other things. It's love that makes a person courageous. Love diminishes the power of pride. Love gives you the ability to follow Jesus even to his death. And that's what Peter was called on to do one day. Like his Lord, Peter later died by crucifixion. Peter wrote about this truth in one of his letters to his friends, in the book of 1 Peter, chapter 4 and verse 8. "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins." Let's pull this all together. Today we met a man who started as an unknown, but whose name is remembered as one of the most important leaders in history. How did that happen? Was it like Forrest Gump, where heart and hard work and luck allowed a man to overcome his deficits and wind up as a successful celebrity? No, it was not luck at all. Peter was a man who started with many deficits. What mattered was that he accepted the invitation of Jesus Christ. He spent time with Jesus. He let Jesus show him his weaknesses, because it's in weakness that God can show us his power. He let Jesus show him how to love, and it's love that covers a multitude of sins. The message for us: accept the invitation of Jesus. Follow him. Spend time with him. Let him show you your weaknesses. Let him show you how to love. Maybe you'll be changed from an unknown to a celebrity, but more likely, you'll be rewarded with a deep knowledge of God. And in the end, that is the greatest thing of all. You just heard a message by Phil Brainerd, From Peter the Unknown to Peter the Great. If you want to learn more, come visit us. We're in Trinity Church of Teaneck, New Jersey. Our website is trinityteaneck.org, or visit my site, philbrainerd.com. May the Lord richly bless you.